It's such a genuine honor to welcome Professor Laura Pulido. Professor Polito is the Collins Professor of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies and Geography at the University of Oregon, and she's also a Centennial Professor at the London School for Economics. A scholar with deep roots here, she holds a PhD in urban planning from UCLA, but also a degree in geography from this very university. Prior to her position in Oregon, she taught at the University of Southern California for over 2 decades. The core of Laura's groundbreaking research explores the critical relationship between race, place, and social and environmental processes. She has devoted much of her career to studying environmental racism, meticulously examining how racism is both conceptualized and operationalized in environmental justice scholarship and practice. More recently, her work investigates how white supremacy and white nationalism impact climate denial and refusal. Alongside this, she has been studying the role of cultural memory in shaping the US as a white nation. As part of her scholarship, Laura is deeply committed to public scholarship and popular education. Her influential ideas are captured in numerous seminal books, including Environmentalism and Economic Justice, Two Chicano Struggles in the Southwest, A People's Guide to Los Angeles, co-authored with Laura Barkoloth and Wendy Cheng, and a personal favorite of mine, Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left, Radical Activism in Los Angeles. Her exceptional contributions have been recognized with numerous honors, including the Cullum Geographical Medal for the American Geographical Society, the Presidential Achievement Award from the Association of American Geographers, and both Ford and Guggenheim Fellowships. Her current work on landscapes of historical commemoration is funded by the National Science Foundation, and in 2025, she became a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Laura, it's really an honor to have you join us.
Thank you, Lola, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to everybody from the Haven Center that have worked to make this happen. I appreciate all the effort that you've put into it. Do I do share now?
Yes, you do.
Okay. There we go. All right. Very good. As you all know, our country is going through a very dark time. So it gives me some measure of joy to be with you today to talk about racial and climate politics, as it gives me some sense of agency, however limited and fleeting. As a geographer and ethnic studies scholar, I have been closely following the attacks on U.S. democracy on many fronts, including mass deportations, the erosion of due process, the dismantling of the administrative state, the resurgence and valorization of white supremacy, and of course, environmental deregulation. Since Trump took office in January, we have seen a massive wave of deregulation, including polluters being able to request an exemption from the Clean Air Act simply by emailing the president. We've seen the opening of public lands to extraction with expedited permitting processes. Projects that used to take a year can now be permitted in 2 weeks. There have been efforts to quash the energy transition. Tax credits for renewable energy are ending, as well as federal funding for new and experimental energy projects. And finally, we have seen the wholesale dismantling of environmental justice initiatives at the federal level. At last month's UN General Assembly, Trump declared that climate change was the, quote, greatest con job ever perpetuated on the world, unquote, and that the scientific consensus on global warming was created by stupid people. This is where we are at. The question for me is, how did we get here? I became interested in the Republican Party's climate obstruction several years ago because I wanted to understand why we refuse to stop using fossil fuels in the face of impending disaster. According to the UN, we now have a zero chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Of course, there's many reasons why we are on such a course of action. At the risk of oversimplification, I noticed that the geography literature tended to fall into two major vectors. On the one hand, we have studies focused on individual and group attitudes, perceptions, and actions. And on the other, we have the role of the fossil fuel industry, capital in general, but particularly the fossil fuel industry. While both are crucial, I felt something was missing: politicians. Fortunately, a growing number of scholars are researching them. Typically, they are assumed to be the enablers of the fossil fuel industry, the ones implementing its agenda. And while there's overwhelmingly evidence to support this, I also felt it was not complete. Thus, I began collecting data on what exactly the GOP, or the Grand Old Party, another term for the Republicans, have been doing in terms of climate. Although the Trump 2.0 agenda has unfolded fast and furious, we must remember that part of it was planned. Two things in particular have facilitated this high-speed agenda. First, Project 2025, a policy blueprint by the Heritage Foundation that details conservative recommendations and changes. And second, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. DOGE, of course, was headed by Elon Musk and adopted his management style of slash and burn and ask questions later. Both contributed to the rapid and profound climate policy changes in Trump 2.0. But still, they are not enough to explain the complete dismantling of federal climate infrastructure. Such wholesale dismantling requires ideological and political preparation. Paths must be built to facilitate such utter destruction, especially when it was not something that the public has been demanding. This led me to the prehistory of the present moment. What paved the way for the current dismantling? By tracing the evolution of right-wing climate and racial politics, I argue that white nationalism, as manifested in the war on wokeness, became linked to climate obstruction and set the stage for today's dismantling. I first began tracking the GOP when I saw some baffling things. For example, in 2022 in North Carolina, they proposed a law banning public EV charging stations unless there were public gas stations offering free gas. They actually allocated money to destroy charging stations that did not comply. At first, I assumed that politicians were just doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry, what is often called regulatory capture. But as I looked at the data, I realized there was more going on. With the help of research assistants, I began building a database of GOP obstruction from 2009 through the 2024 presidential election. So in order to lay out my argument today, I'm first going to briefly discuss the importance of temporality to understanding environmental change. Second, I explain why the GOP's actions are not merely a case of regulatory capture. Third, I discuss the evolution of the GOP's climate obstruction. Next, I focus on how the war on wokeness set the stage for today's climate dismantling. And finally, I highlight some of the impacts on environmental justice. So let me begin by touching on environmental changes and temporality. I remember when I was in college in the 1980s, I used to think of U.S. environmental problems in very simplistic terms. Pollution increased, regulation increased, and this would eventually result in improved environmental conditions. I believe this partly because I experienced it living in Los Angeles. For decades, LA had the worst air pollution in the U.S. But finally, we got serious in the 1990s about cleaning it up, and it made a huge difference. As a child, I could rarely see the mountains that define Los Angeles Basin, the San Gabriel Mountains, and I simply accepted the burning in my throat as life in LA. But early in the century, that burning had begun to recede, and I could often see the mountains. Unfortunately, many of those gains have been eroded recently by the increase in wildfires. One study found that up to 25% of air quality gains have been eroded by wildfires in the U.S. I shared this story to highlight how environmental quality, practices, and policy can vary over time, often in unanticipated ways. We can have acute moments of environmental worsening, such as disasters, or there is the slow violence that Rob Nixon talks about. Likewise, there's moments of cleanup and improvement, and moments of reversal. Well, thus far, greenhouse gas emissions are only going in one direction. Our efforts at climate mitigation are varied and complex. We have periods of action, hope, failure, and obstruction. Given the deep history of climate denial and obstruction in the U.S., scholars have developed various terms to describe negative climate action. My colleague and friend Kari Norgaard, for example, frames climate inaction as existing along the spectrum. We can imagine ignorance, denial, and enabling. Ignorance implies that policymakers don't act because they lack information. Presumably, the problem could be solved with more and better information. Well, perhaps once true. I don't think anybody believes that anymore. Robert Rule emphasizes the organized and collective nature of negative climate action, what he calls the climate change counter-movement. He explores the many connections between the fossil fuel industry, foundations, and think tanks, including their disinformation campaigns. Here, he has identified the components of the counter-movement. We have oil and gas, auto industry, coal and steel, the larger conservative movement, and business in general. Well, he sees politicians as important actors. They're typically the frontmen of larger campaigns, as he sees it. Building on such work, I would like to offer a revised climate spectrum for politicians, the spectrum of inaction. It has ignorance, denial, obstruction, and dismantling. I define obstruction as intentional and systematic efforts to block actions that would mitigate the climate crisis and environmental injustice. The emphasis in obstruction is on stopping or preventing climate action. Dismantling, however, represents a further step along the spectrum. I define it as the systematic destruction of the infrastructure and people who produce the data, knowledge, policies, and actions needed to mitigate the climate crisis and environmental injustice. In the U.S., climate infrastructure is being dismantled at the federal level. This is not to say that climate research and data collection have ceased. They have not. Many scientists are continuing their work to the best of their ability, but it has largely ceased at the federal level, which is not insignificant given the huge role the federal government has played in funding and otherwise supporting climate infrastructure. It's important to stress that these categories are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they denote primary tendencies or logics that characterize particular moments in time. Thus, denial can coexist with dismantling. I'd like to now talk about how we might understand climate obstruction and dismantling. Numerous scholars have theorized climate action and the state. Kasia Paprocki in Threatening Dystopias introduces the concept of climate adaptation regimes. Now, she put this concept in a radically different context from the U.S., Bangladesh. Moreover, it refers to proactive efforts to adapt to climate change, not obstruction or dismantling. Nonetheless, I believe her concept of climate adaptation helps illuminate Trump's climate dismantling. So I have taken her concept and slightly revised it simply as climate regimes, which she defines as a socially and historically specific configuration of power that governs the landscape of possible intervention in the face of climate change. I argue that the Trump administration constitutes a climate regime. It is essentially an anti-climate regime, as my colleague Tiana Bruno has observed. Paprocki identifies three processes associated with climate regimes: imagination, experimentation, and dispossession. These exist in Trump's climate regime as well. Imagination refers to the ideas and discourses about how to dismantle climate infrastructure. Experimentation are the policies, actions, and projects of actually dismantling. And dispossession refers to those who lose their jobs, livelihoods, homes, and lives because of climate dismantling. I also want to bring in Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective because of their close attention they pay to culture, which I think is quite significant here. They argue that climate obstruction is located at the nexus of the state, culture, and industry. In fact, the climate denial machine, as they call it, operates as an ideological system. If we look closely at the climate regime, we can see how each part, imagination, experimentation, and dispossession, are produced in the nexus of state, culture. When studying U.S. climate regimes, it's important to realize that both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, have actively supported fossil fuels. But the two parties are not the same, at least not anymore. Democrats have a record of attempting climate action, however limited and problematic. Since the Kyoto Protocol, capitalist climate governance has been the norm. Capitalist climate governance is not denial, but strategies that postpone meaningful action while creating new opportunities for capital. The GOP once supported capitalist climate governance as it aligned with free markets and new industries. But those days are long gone. As numerous scholars have documented, Republican politicians are the fossil fuel industry's primary enablers. Just follow the money. 80% of all fossil fuel money goes to Republicans. And I think in Trump's last campaign, he received $75 billion from the fossil fuel industry in exchange for, promising them that he would implement their agenda. As powerful as it is, again, I don't think it's the whole story. There's four shortcomings I have identified with the regulatory capture narrative. First, the GOP has not always aligned with the fossil fuel industry in the way that it does today. Second, the GOP's climate obstruction and dismantling does not reflect its voters' desires. Third, this overlooks the role of race and assumes a non-racial state. And lastly, it ignores the larger cultural meanings embedded in climate change. And I'll briefly address each. Capital is nothing if not practical. It knows the future and is planning for energy alternatives and maintaining fossil fuel production. From a capitalist perspective, this makes perfect sense. For example, much of the fossil fuel industry would have preferred the U.S. remain in the Paris Climate Accord, if only to maintain a seat at the table. And despite Trump's efforts to kill the EV market in the U.S., Ford is introducing an electronic truck for the global market because they know this is where everything is moving. And then we have big oil who are trying to fashion themselves as new carbon managers. Now, I don't want to greenwash the fossil fuel industry, far from it, but it contrasts with the GOP, who literally oppose everything. And recall, the GOP has not always been this way. The Bush administration, working with the fossil fuel industry's Global Climate Coalition, left the Kyoto Protocol in 2001. Instead, it introduced the Clear Skies Initiative, a much weaker plan based on voluntary cutbacks and tax credits. Here, the GOP is bowing to industry, but realizes the need for some action. Today, this would be unthinkable in the Republican Party. Number 2, the GOP's climate obstruction does not reflect the desires of its base, especially younger voters. Research indicates that large majorities of Americans believe climate change is real. 94% of Democrats and 67% of Republicans believe in climate change. And the red here indicates Republican voters. See, and we hit a low point in 2001, and then we have moved back up closer to 70%. Furthermore, over 60% of Republicans believe the government should take some action to address climate change. And again, focus on the red, well over 60%. Now, there's definitely disagreement on many issues. In particular, the different parties give different weight to climate among a range of different issues. But nevertheless, I argue that the GOP's actions do not reflect its base. Its base is not clamoring for climate dismantling. Instead, the GOP must sell climate dismantling to its base. The third reason we need to look beyond regulatory capture is that it assumes a non-racial state. Recall that the climate denial machine exists at the intersection of the state and civil society. If race is a material discursive formation embedded in U.S. history, territory, culture, and state, it inevitably plays a role in many topics seemingly unrelated to race. Heather McGee in The Sum of Us shows how racism costs all Americans and is responsible for such things as the absence of universal health care. She argues that because whites worried Black people would disproportionately benefit from universal health care, they opposed it altogether. I think her work is significant because it shows the unanticipated consequences of racism. We can see its surplus nature and how it spills out onto issues seemingly unrelated to race. The final problem stemming from a regulatory capture framework is that it overlooks the many meanings embedded in fossil fuels and climate change. Naomi Klein has argued that the right understands the profound challenges that climate change poses to its worldview and values. She argues that climate change is in fact an indictment of capitalism. It poses a crisis not just to our physical world, but to the right's ideology of free markets, individualism, and specific conceptions of freedom. A great example of this was the light bulb uproar in the U.S. Several years ago, the U.S. tried to shift from incandescent to LED lights for greater energy efficiency. The GOP led a campaign against it, equating light bulbs with freedom. This is a wonderful example of the many meanings embedded in climate, which we ignore at our own peril. All of these are really examples of the imagination of the climate regime, the discursive and narrative ideas that set the stage for experimentation. White nationalism is not just part of our climate imaginary, but of the nation itself. As many scholars have shown, white nationalism is a central feature of the U.S. right. It's kind of like its mitochondria. It generates endless energy that can be used for all kinds of purposes. Drawing on both Benedict Anderson and Sunera Thubani, I define the white nation as an imagined sovereign political community in which white people and whiteness are centered. It's important to emphasize that anyone can be a member of the white nation. You just have to be willing to look for whiteness. Because whiteness is a hierarchical, genocidal, and exclusionary category, its legitimacy requires the erasure of its violence. This entails the cultivation and maintenance of white innocence. The problem for the white nation is that it is facing multiple crises, not only of the demographics of the U.S. changing, what is sometimes called the Great Replacement, but the very innocence of the white nation has been challenged in recent years, as evident in Black Lives Matter and calls for racial and colonial reckoning. Thus, the right is contending with two existential crises. I wish to focus in the overlapping section here in the Venn diagram. This is where white nationalism becomes linked to climate dismantling. White nationalism has been key to the GOP's success for decades, starting with the Southern strategy in the 1970s, when the GOP turned its back on Black voters and decided to tie their fate to white Southerners. This allowed them to make overt appeals to white supremacy. The GOP learned that actively cultivating white grievance and resentment works. In both Trump campaigns, he relied heavily on white nationalism to attract supporters and get out the vote. This first slide here is from a very famous one from his when he announced his 2015 presidential candidacy. And this is from his second campaign when he had the big uproar about immigrants eating dogs in Ohio. In both cases, of course, he's using white nationalism to attract supporters and get out the vote. As such, white nationalism produces value for the right through votes, political energy, and for the larger fossil fuel industry itself. Let us now turn to the evolution of Republican climate obstruction and dismantlement. Although the GOP once engaged in capitalist climate governance, that changed as it shifted further to the right and the U.S. became more polarized. Party dynamics are essential to understanding this process. Political polarization both relies on and produces a set of values and ideologies that are ascribed to each side. These constellations are framed as moral binaries. As climate became polarized, it became part of a larger climate regime. By linking climate change to a larger constellation, specifically one that includes wokeness and DEI, new political experiments could be tried out. Key to this rightward shift was the Tea Party movement, which emerged in 2009 in the wake of the fiscal crisis. It unleashed a torrent of white rage that swept 138 new Republicans into Congress. The Tea Party ushered in a new political landscape centered on non-cooperation and polarization. Reversing previous trends, it contributed to an uptick in denial. An energized GOP went on the attack, including Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who argued against the existence of a scientific consensus in response to the leaked emails of the Climate Research Unit at East Anglia University in 2009. The Tea Party declined with Trump's first presidential campaign, as it essentially morphed into MAGA. During the Trump era, we see a major increase in climate obstruction. Besides leaving the Paris Climate Accord, 112 Obama-era environmental regulations were overturned, including the Clean Power Plan, which was the U.S. first effort to shift away from power infrastructure based on fossil fuels. This slide shows just one estimate of the emissions generated from the rollbacks. And here it's categorized by different sources of emissions, but the cumulative one is quite high. But Trump 1.0 also demonstrates the connections between climate imaginaries and experiments. Trump was a master of linking climate to multiple political and cultural formations. The war on coal provides one example of how climate became polarized. The war on coal was what Trump called the Obama administration's climate regime. Trump declared the war over in March 2017 when he passed an executive order revoking rules on carbon emissions. But the war on coal was never just about carbon emissions. It performed significant ideological and imaginative work. The war on coal was a discursive strategy that flipped what was becoming normative thinking regarding carbon emissions, i.e., we need to limit them. Instead, it celebrated coal with promises to restore the industry. Obviously, this didn't happen, as market forces, especially natural gas, have reduced its viability. Nonetheless, the celebration of coal paved the way for redeeming the larger fossil fuel industry, an experiment which is bearing fruit today. Equally important, the war on coal was a way to connect with coal miners, 90% of whom are white and 93% of whom are men. As such, they represent an important demographic: rural, white, male, working-class voters. Trump used coal to portray himself as a friend of workers, successfully linking together struggling whites, anti-elitism, and the fossil fuel industry. This is the politics of recognition. In this way, Trump positioned a relatively sympathetic population as anti-climate, while those who did not support coal were considered antagonistic to rural communities. This is political polarization in action. The war on wokeness. Wokeness was initially the right's caricature of left politics. It began by ridiculing identity politics, pronouns, and anti-racism. But we all know how far it has come. It has gone from ridicule to a series of executive actions. It has become the basis for withholding federal funding from a wide array of institutions and programs, whether legal or not. As such, we can see how it has gone from imagination to experiment. Although we can trace the roots of wokeness to the 1970s, it matured in response to the anti-racist movement that emerged after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. As you will recall, there was mass political support for Black Lives Matter across the country and even globally. Kimberly Crenshaw argues that the war of wokeness is the backlash to the insistence that Black lives actually do matter, as well as calls for a racial and colonial reckoning. Throughout U.S. history, all forms of racial progress have been followed by a white backlash dating back to Reconstruction. The current backlash began with critiques of the police as racist. The right responded by defending police or Blue Lives Matter. They especially rejected claims that police were racist. This is important because white innocence was being directly attacked by anti-racist activists. So, the white nation mobilized. While this is happening culturally, there were also major shifts in U.S. party politics. It is a conjuncture of these two spheres that leads to the war on wokeness, the backlash against wokeism and party politics. After Trump's presidency, two important things happen. First, Biden gets elected, and we see some actual progress on climate, specifically the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or the IRA, which was the U.S. most significant climate legislation to date. Second, the fight for the soul of the Republican Party begins. It may be hard to believe this now, but many in the GOP came to believe that Trump was a liability given his impeachment and role in the January 6th insurrection. Accordingly, many Republicans wanted a change in leadership. However, Trump still controlled the GOP base, MAGA. The political dynamics surrounding the battle for the control of the GOP are key to this story. GOP candidates began competing with each other, trying to win over MAGA. To do this, they competed to stake out the most right-wing positions. This went on until January 2024, when Ron DeSantis dropped out of the Republican primary. Of course, no politician succeeded. Both Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis made it a centerpiece of their campaigns. Ron DeSantis declared that his state, Florida, was, quote, where wokeness goes to die, unquote. And Ramaswamy wrote a whole book attacking corporate wokeness. The war on wokeness essentially divided the U.S. into those who believe that white supremacy was important to U.S. history and culture, versus those who not only reject that belief, but insist that whites are threatened by discrimination, demographic replacement, and the decentrate of whiteness. The war on wokeness started with critical race theory, or CRT. It was the brainchild of Chris Rufo, a conservative commentator who created a moral panic by distorting an academic field into a white racial grievance. According to Rufo, quote, the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. It has been enormously successful. The war on wokeness have created energy that the right has harnessed for multiple purposes. Children are key to the war on wokeness. Opponents of CRT claim it was used to indoctrinate students and led some students to feel discomfort when discussing the racial past. Accordingly, the GOP began limiting what teachers could say about race in K-12 education. Soon, statewide laws placed limits on discussions of race. Between September 2020 and April 2024, 807 bills, executive orders, and statements have been introduced across the U.S. The bills vary in their scope, ambiguity, and provisions. Some require that teachers tell both sides of racial issues, while others require that no one is made to feel discomfort when discussing the racial past. In North Dakota, teachers are prohibited from presenting racism as anything other than individual biases. In other words, structural racism does not exist. As of June 2024, there were only 6 states where anti-CRT legislation had not been introduced. Attacks on CRT quickly spread to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. While CRT can be understood as a set of ideas, DEI is more about praxis. In the eyes of the Trump administration, this can be anything from academic assistance for underrepresented students to student cultural centers, as well as to ethnic studies. Just last week, I heard that UT Austin is trying to dismantle Black studies, Latino studies, and women and gender studies. Opposition to DEI began at schools, but spread to other institutions, including corporations. In this map here, we can see where anti-DEI legislation has been introduced in higher education. The gray hexagons are states where no bill has been introduced. The war on wokeness soon moved into gender and sexuality. Florida's infamous Don't Say Gay bill, HB 1557, signaled the new terrain. Passed in March 2023, it banned classroom discussions of gender identity or sexual orientation in primary schools. This was followed by HB 1069, which banned the use of pronouns consistent with the student's gender identity. This ferocious energy against anti-racism, gender equality, and the right to be queer and trans has been a winning strategy for the right. Everything linked to DEI becomes tainted, including climate. Unlike other elements of DEI, climate has presented a challenge for the GOP, however, as public opinion is not on its side. As we've seen, solid majorities, including Republicans, believe climate change is real and support some kind of action, especially modest efforts. Because the GOP's position is not popular, it needs other ways to frame climate. Enter the war on wokeness. Climate obstruction builds on the war on wokeness in several ways. Oh, sorry, I missed that one. There we go. First, it clearly locates climate in the culture wars and is part of the, quote, woke fiefdom, as the GOP calls it. Second, it borrows strategies and language from wokeness, especially bannings. Third, it insists that the real existential threat is wokeness, not climate change. The heart of the war on wokeness is restricting what can be said, done, and read through bannings. Although not widely supported by the general public, MAGA has embraced bans. Bannings are high-visibility events that solidify politicians' conservative credentials and forge relationships with conservative activists. Many of the local book bannings are spearheaded by groups like Moms for Liberty, who work closely with Republican politicians. Here, we can see where book bannings have been especially active. The darker the color, the greater the number of bannings. This same tactic has been used to support climate obstruction. For example, Florida's HR 1645 bans the word climate change from state laws and shift policy priorities to energy dominance. This is an example of kind of the idea, imagination beginning at the local state, Florida, and then moving up to the federal level, which is now embraced in executive actions. In Texas, a bill was introduced that would block 8th graders from learning about climate. In Arizona, Republicans passed a law that would ban the use of public funding for any, quote, Marxist ideology. Under this law, the public could sue if they saw public funds being used to promote any Marxist ideology. Needless to say, this included climate action. In Ohio, a bill was introduced, SB 83, that explicitly linked climate to higher education's woke fiefdom. It sought to ban diversity training while requiring alternative theories on climate, immigration, and abortion. Although it failed, it illustrates how climate has been fully incorporated into the war on wokeness and was part of a larger right-wing constellation. These are all examples of imagination meeting experimentation. But the experiments get more intense when it comes to ESG, or environment social governance. ESG is an investing practice that requires the disclosure of environmental and social concerns. It emerged approximately 20 years ago to ensure the long-term viability of investment returns, but was also used to encourage corporate accountability regarding coerced labor, working conditions, sexual harassment, racial bias, and environmental impacts. Climate change became part of ESG because many investors felt such information was required to fully assess the risk associated with a particular investment. Will the building I want to buy be underwater in 20 years? Not surprisingly, insurance companies have led the way in insisting that climate change be considered. But because climate has become part of woke capitalism, it has drawn the ire of the GOP. The war on woke capitalism has two goals. First, it seeks to undermine industries linked to the reviled woke agenda. And second, it is meant to demonstrate the reach and power of liberal culture, i.e., the libs have even infiltrated investment. As one commentator explained, ESG is a direct assault on the heart and soul of the free market economy, unquote. This is important because it creates an enemy for the GOP to wage war against, which is what a party of grievance always needs, enemies. GOP opposition to ESG began in 2020. According to a New York Times investigation, ESG became a target when some oil and gas companies complained of hostility and declining investment. They felt they were being discriminated against, and they probably were, as a growing number of institutions were divesting from fossil fuels. In response, I missed a slide, sorry about that. In response, the State Financial Officers Federation, SFOF, an historically bipartisan organization, went on the offensive. This is a little-known organization that has been weaponized by the right. SFOF has two goals in terms of ESG. First, encourage state laws that restrict firms employing ESG criteria, and second, blocking federal nominees who support climate risk disclosure or who are even critical of the fossil fuel industry. In 2023, 165 bills and regulations were introduced across 37 states to limit ESG. Texas was the first to pass legislation restricting state agencies' engagement with firms who quote, boycott fossil fuels. This was SB 13. Laws soon followed in West Virginia, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Florida, and other states. In November 2021, a group of red states began developing laws patterned on Texas's. These laws vary considerably. Florida's HB 3 limits government agencies at all levels from considering ESG, whereas West Virginia's SB 262 creates a list of suspect firms and places them on a restricted list. Placing firms on a restricted list not only precludes firms from doing business in the state, but the announcements themselves are important media events. According to State Treasurer Riley Moore, quote, if a bank has a no-lending policy as relates to thermal coal, we'll find a bank that doesn't have that policy, unquote. In March 2023, 18 states formed an alliance to, quote, protect individuals from the ESG movement, unquote. All of this has been at the state level, but red states led by the SFOF have also challenged federal ESG rules. As mentioned earlier, ESG began in 2004 and gained traction among corporations. The next step was to codify ESG in investing law and practices. The European Union adapted standards in 2023, as did the International Sustainability Standards Board. From a capitalist point of view, having a shared set of standards is desirable. Accordingly, the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, which oversees all investing, pursued a similar path. In 2022, the SEC introduced a provision to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures for investors. This was an effort to do just that, enhance and standardize climate disclosures. To facilitate the process, the SEC developed 3 levels known as Scopes 1, 2, and 3. While Scopes 1 and 2 focus on the firm itself, Scope 3 required disclosures of greenhouse gas emissions up and down the supply chain. For fossil fuel companies, this would have meant calculating and publicizing greenhouse gas emissions associated with the transportation sector, which would have been massive. A Republican uproar ensued. The SOF responded by opposing the provision and writing, "The proposed rule indulges in irrational climate exceptionalism, elevating climate issues to a place of prominence in disclosures that they did not deserve. The proposed rule is also about forcing issuers to take actions in compliance with a political agenda," unquote. Here, the SFOF is not only rejecting climate concerns, but is forcefully countering climate activists' influence. In the end, the final rule passed without Scope 3. That decision was challenged in court, and in March 2025, Under the direction of Trump, the SEC stopped defending that case. As U.S. investment firms are shying away from assessing climate risk, numerous firms have left Climate Action 100 Plus, a global group of investors who seek to use their money to push corporations to reduce emissions. While European firms are joining Climate Action 100, U.S. firms are leaving. The GOP has also opposed federal appointees who embrace ESG or are otherwise critical of the fossil fuel industry. In 2021, Saule Omowara was nominated for the position of U.S. Comptroller for Currency. She had previously been critical of fossil fuels. In November, the SOF opposed her nomination, and in December, she was forced to withdraw her name. A larger debacle surrounded Sharon Raskin Bloom, who was nominated by President Trump as vice chair of the Federal Reserve. She had argued that responsible investing required full transparency regarding climate. In February 2022, she was opposed by the SFOF, and in March, Biden withdrew her candidacy. As I have said, the GOP sees the war on wokeness and ESG as a winning set of issues. Representative Bank of Indiana claimed that wokeness was the greatest domestic threat to American society. And Patrick McHenry of North Carolina created the Republican ESG Working Group. Given all of this, it should not be surprising that in Trump's first week back in office, he issued sweeping executive actions targeting DEI and wokeness. The first one, ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferences, was actually passed on his first day, right after his inauguration. The second one, ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity, was passed on day 2, which I think indicates the high priority given to these issues, as well as the importance of the symbolism. Through these executive orders, anything remotely connected to DEI was put on the chopping block and rendered illegal. This includes environmental justice. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, during Trump 1.0, they never really went after EJ. I think there's 2 reasons for this. 1, they didn't really know what it was. And 2, they lacked the administrative skills and capacity to attack it. But not so in Trump 2.0. Project 2025 had an entire chapter, of course, on the EPA and specifically addresses EJ. Nevertheless, even Project 2025 didn't call for the dismantling of environmental justice. Rather, it suggests modifications and contractions, particularly around the IRA. But this is not what happened under Trump 2.0. By invoking the executive orders, he was able to terminate the entire federal environmental justice infrastructure in one fell swoop. These are just some of the things that have been dismantled. The Department of Justice Office of Environmental Justice. This is a group that would go after polluters and threaten with lawsuits and whatnot. We have the EPA's EJ Screen Tool. This was an online tool in which anybody can go and look up different communities and how they're being impacted by polluters. There was the EPA's EJ Grants Program. The EPA ran many different kinds of grant programs for local communities to help them build capacity against environmental injustice. And I should say I've been very critical in the past about many of these programs in terms of the actual efficacy. Nonetheless, the dismantling is a whole different ballgame. We have seen the mass firing of environmental justice staff, the closure of federal and regional environmental justice offices. We have seen the termination of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, known as MEJAC. There also was a White House council that was created under the Biden administration, which has also been terminated. We've seen the erasure of environmental justice from the EPA's website. The rescission of Justice 40 initiative funds. This was a piece of parallel legislation, kind of like a companion to the IRA, which required that all environmental and infrastructure funds, 40% of them, had to be targeted to historically underserved communities. And those were rescinded. And we've seen the termination of environmental justice lawsuits and settlements against polluters. In many cases, these were suits that were developed during the Biden and even the Obama era, these lawsuits against major polluters, and they have all just been terminated by the Trump administration. Clearly, environmental justice programs are especially vulnerable in Trump 2.0. Not only are they environmental programs, but they are deeply linked to wokeness and DEI almost by definition. The most effective tool for the dismantling of both climate action and EJ has been their connection to DEI. Other tools have been and are being used, but they are more time-consuming and less certain. For example, just last week, the Department of Energy announced it would cancel $7.5 billion in clean energy projects. Because these projects had already been approved and funded by Congress, the states that had proposed them will now sue the federal government. And it is uncertain what the courts will rule. The Trump administration has been ordered to restore funding on occasions. This is precisely why these are called experiments. They're attempts to dismantle climate and environmental justice on dubious legal grounds. It's kind of like they throw whatever they can against the wall and let's see what sticks. In contrast, by simply passing executive orders against DEI, dozens of programs promptly became illegal. Once they were rendered illegal, they were dismantled by DOGE. And frankly, it is difficult to imagine how these programs will ever be revived. So to conclude, although the Republican Party has opposed environmental regulation for decades, I never imagined that DEI would become a tool for dismantling large swaths of environmental regulation, policy, and infrastructure. I have a hard time, however, believing that the fossil fuel industry came up with this idea, especially since it practiced DEI itself. Well, this is very much the work of politicians and political parties. By framing Trump 2.0 as a climate regime, specifically an anti-climate one, we can trace how various imaginaries led to a series of climate experiments. The right has drawn on a wide array of ideas and ideologies, especially white nationalism, as manifested in the war on wokeness. We must always place the war on wokeness, however, in its proper historical context. It is the latest chapter of the racial backlash. In this case, the backlash against Black Lives Matter and a larger culture of racial liberalism. Trump's climate regime highlights the excess nature of and unanticipated consequences of white nationalism. The white backlash has generated enormous energy that the GOP has been able to direct in unanticipated ways. Never can we underestimate the power of the white nation to maintain its privileged place in society with negative consequences for the entire planet. Thanks.
How do you interpret the transatlantic divergence, European finance embedding ESG while U.S. states dismantle it, in terms of larger capitalist realignment? Malm, who you cited earlier, situates right-wing climate politics within European racial regimes. The question asker is interested in how you think of a comparative analysis might offer additional leverage or insight.
Well, I love the work by Malm and Lizette, their work. It's fantastic. When I read their work, however, I also feel, I know they have a chapter on the U.S., but they're really talking so much about the European experience, I think. And that is really based on immigration. And while immigration clearly is super important in the case of the United States, what we all, know what's happening, I don't think it adequately addresses what's going on in the United States because of our deep history of anti-Black racism. We have a much more complicated racial history than just more recent immigration. So I think that's an important difference that needs to be attended to in comparing them. And I also should say, being here in London too, I'm become a little bit more, aware what's happening in the UK as well as other parts of the EU. And well, they're light years away in some ways from the United States. I also see them moving in this direction. In fact, just this morning on BBC4 Radio, they were talking about, the UK's made important progress in terms of moving away from fossil fuels. But now they're talking about maybe we need to tinker with this a little bit because the cost of living is so high. We still want to move, of course, towards an energy transition. But, right now we need just affordable energy for everybody. So I think it's really important too, the extent to which Trump, I think, has, he's part of a larger right-wing movement, but he really is also giving permission for many other countries, I think, to begin backsliding on climate as well. So we'll see what happens.
My question to you, Laura, just from a practitioner standpoint, or that of if I identify as an activist, and you were speaking to a group of activists potentially, what would you advise them? What is the way to fight back or to fight forward in this context and with these under these conditions?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I have to say I'm pretty cynical right now, and I don't have a lot of hope. I especially don't have a lot of hope given the state of the Democratic Party. Nevertheless, I do think the one thing that I can absolutely say needs to happen is we need to keep organizing. We need to keep organizing at multiple geographic scales. And I also think it's really important that we have to begin building a united front. Just as we saw how, or at least I argue, that DEI and wokeness, white nationalism, it plays a role in what's happening with climate. We can use that information, and that's important information in terms of thinking about the kind of broad-based movement that we need to build. And we may not all agree with each other on so many different things, but that's the only thing that I can imagine that's going to change things. And it may take a really, really long time because we're in a really dark place,
Yeah, thank you for that. Another question we have from the audience: if we think that these right-wing projects, if we think of them as imaginative experiments, what might you see as their next phase? I mean, this brings us even down an even darker path, I suppose. But is there a version of green nationalism on the horizon? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, there was been and has been a completely clear path for an earlier version of Republicans to go with green energy, and it's something that the left, we could have complained about. It's, it's not including environmental justice. It's not linking labor, all these other kinds of things, which is true, but it could have pursued a path, of free markets. Come on. I mean, that was a total possibility. And, again, in the European context, there's a lot more of that, the green nationalism that is happening, that we can point to in different countries. But that is so not happening here. And again, it's kind of, again, the meanings that are happening that are being attached to climate action, to renewable energy, that are precluding that from happening. Now, it is possible that, I mean, frankly, if you ask me, I think the GOP is going to be in power for a very long period of time because of the redistricting that they're doing as we speak, because in the way the electoral game is set up to favor rural areas, the whole variety of different kinds of reasons why I think it's going to go on. And, if there's a shift in the GOP to something that is even more economically rational, we could maybe move in that direction. But I don't know that that's going to happen. Right now, kind of the economics they're kind of irrational, right? It would make much more sense, like, let's pursue both, and I know even for a while, Texas had this kind of policy, like we want all energy, right? Because they actually are the place that has the greatest level now of renewable energy, in the US, despite their politics, right? It's kind of like they don't talk about green energy. They just talk about more energy, right? But I'm not seeing that yet.
Okay. Another question. Again, inviting everybody in the audience who does not feel comfortable to address Laura yourself. You can always direct a question at me and I'll read it out for you. But we have one that says, that's a follow-up from your last response. The idea of political experiments implies that the right might be learning. Do you see the right as iterating towards an increasingly sophisticated climate politics, or as reacting impulsively within the culture war logic? Do you think the notion, keep going? Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I think it's super important to understand the way the right completely is evolving and experimenting and learning, I think for a long time, the right was studying the left far more than the left was studying the right. So they understand us way better than we understand them. Having said that, again, with the climate, no. Again, maybe if Trump hopefully will be out of office one day. And, I can even imagine any number of other kind of Republicans pursuing a different kind of policy around climate. But right now, it's hard to imagine where that is. I mean, we know there's an end game to fossil fuels, right? And we know the global economy is so moving in the other direction, right? We passed a tipping point, of where we're going. And we're choosing to be like, not moving along with it, right?
Ian Carrillo, it's lovely to see you here in the room. You did have your hand up, so I'm going to click on the button to say allowed to talk. Do let me know if you inadvertently raised your hand, but we would love for you to ask a question directly to Laura. Ian, are you
okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Do you want to turn on your camera if you have the opportunity?
Hi, Ian.
Go ahead, Ian. There you are. Oh, you keep muting yourself.
Okay, everyone. Thank you so much, Laura. This is a really excellent talk. I'm curious. It seemed that your case started like in the 2000s, or at least what we saw with the presentation today. And so I'm kind of curious if you could like link that, or how you see this linking to like the previous decades where there were these sort of connections, maybe less prominent than what we see today, but connections between racism and anti-environmentalism, some of the racism and the conservation movement. So I'm curious, like how you see what we're experiencing right now, building on some elements that have already existed.
Gosh, interesting question. So, so I can talk about racism, right? And I really believe it's true. When I talk about, the backlash, that's from Carol Anderson's work, right? The racial backlash. And I've been involved in this research project that's thinking about kind of like the territorial origins of the United States in terms of trying to understand like cultural memory. And as the deeper I go back, it's like, it's pretty profound to think about the deeply racialized nature of the United States from very early on. And that's not to say people came here with ready-made ideas about white supremacy. They're mostly religious ideas, but pretty quickly, in terms of engagements with Indigenous people, different kinds of racial subjectivities and collectivities develop. And it's a pretty white supremacist, culture we've been living with, for quite a number of centuries. It doesn't start in 76, right? It's very deep. And to my mind, it's just always going to surface in different kinds of ways. It's kind of like in moments, particularly moments of crisis, white supremacy and it's kind of like our go-to response, right? This is what we go back on and rely on to help us navigate difficult situations, right? So it's not surprising to me that here in this moment, it's coming up in all kinds of different ways. To think more, and certainly we can look to the history. I mean, there's so much great scholarship that's happened in terms of, public lands and, right, dispossession of Native peoples, and thinking about, a much more expanded set of ecological relations over the centuries. But thinking even more specifically, like starting in the 1960s and 70s with the environmental movement, right? Which again, lots of people have done work on the racist dimensions of that. When you talk to, it seems to me like in interviews I've heard, like with people on the right, they just think that's crazy. What do you mean environmentalism is racist, right? What do you mean? It would just, because they have a very contracted sense of what constitutes racism, right? And this environmentalism is one thing, and racism another thing, and so they don't compute. And one could even argue that the extent to which I think with on the left, more and more issues have been connected to racism, that has created a greater backlash on the part of the right. I have so many great quotes about people on the right laughing about, like, you think climate's related to race, or, that it's going to have a racial consequence. I mean, it's just like really hard for them to understand. It just is preposterous, So I think this also kind of maybe engenders their hostility to the whole thing. Not sure if I answered your question or not.
Thank you so much for that, Ian. That was great. It was lovely to see you. Hope you're well. We have a question from Anika Rice. I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly, but they write, how do you connect the war on wokeness and anti-climate governance to Trump's rhetoric and actions regarding foreign wars and occupation and genocide, specifically Gaza, Ukraine, Venezuela? We could probably keep going.
I don't know. How do you? I guess they're all cut from the same cloth. I would say more than anything, I see what's important. The parallels I see is in terms of how he goes about implementing those agendas. He does them in ways which are disregard, collaboration with different parts of Congress. He does it, really as a king, right? And to reference the protests that we just had, it just unilaterally, I will do this. I mean, how many people have died now from people on the boat in the Caribbean? I think, is it up to 27 people have been murdered, and he just does this without, there's no consequence, to what's happening. He just does it. Congress doesn't say anything, I mean, Congress has kind of folded. So I guess that's the biggest parallel I see. He can just do whatever he wants to do, and he's allowed to do it by the global community and by domestically here in the U.S.
Laura, I wonder if you have any thoughts on the transition or the development of the right from its Tea Party flavor to its current MAGA iteration. How do you interpret that transformation of the Tea Party from a fiscal populism position to one of cultural grievance politics?
Well, it develops in the wake of the fiscal crises. And, I think a lot of the literature frames it as like this populist economic concerns about the budget, stuff like that. But that's also really not being sufficiently attentive to its racist dimensions as well. I mean, they also merge with the birther movement, right? In terms of refusing to believe that President Obama was born in the United States and therefore was a legitimate president, right? It was just too inconceivable to believe that a Black man was part of the nation, that he could then become the president. And then it also had a very strong anti-immigrant dimension as well, right? And these things tend to be overlooked. So I think, it's maybe it starts off right as the about fiscal responsibility and anger against the Wall Street bailouts, which is a totally legitimate thing to be angry about. I think that's valid, right? And one of the things that we do know also is that it got a lot of funding, like from Americans for Prosperity, from Koch brothers, right, to support that organizing work. And that's not as significant. But again, I don't want to ever pretend like there was not a legitimate set of grievances in the United States. And whoever could kind of best engage in the politics of recognition and could like marshal them together in somewhat of a coherent way, they were going to inherit that kind of energy and rage. So we see very clearly, there's different kinds of timelines about the decline of Tea Party, and boom, it just completely is swept up into MAGA because now they found their man who is going to be their spokesperson, who's going to speak on their behalf, who's going to go after all the imagined, people who were doing wrong, the Democrats, the elites, and what have you in there. So very much, caught up with that. And I think MAGA, there's been important changes in evolution of MAGA itself. In the last election, we saw a huge increase in terms of, people of color joining MAGA, in really unprecedented levels. Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans of, all different kinds. I think for a lot of people, I know, especially in the Latino population, we have a lot of evidence that they were voting for some kind of economic change, right, in terms of addressing the cost of living. But a lot of them too were like becoming anti-immigrant, the whole idea of like pulling up the ladder after them. I'm here now, and these other people are, criminals. They are, preying on us, and we need to get rid of them, right? So it has evolved, definitely MAGA, yeah.
Okay.
I'll say one more.
Yes, please.
I'll say one more thing. I was just reading today in, I think, Boston Review, and they were talking about like within MAGA, some of the tensions that they do have, which, we may not be fully aware of. And that is like, there's one of the huge schisms that they're going to have between the tech industry and immigration, right? That's a big one. And also, parts of MAGA are becoming further and further to the right. We're talking about Christian nationalism coming back in for many people. We're talking about theocracy. People are talking about kings. It's really becoming unimaginable in some ways, and not all MAGA, agrees with that. There's lots of variation, I think, within MAGA, and I think we have to treat it as a serious social movement and study it that way.
Thank you for that. Do you see obstructionism and non-cooperation as a political experiment in itself?
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. Yes. So I typically trace the beginning of like the non-cooperation to Newt Gingrich, right? And he was a really kind of like ushering a whole new kind of political culture. Like we need to engage in non-cooperation. And this is how we are going to both reshape the Republican Party, but also change the norms and practices of what we have come to call a democracy, right? And when you do think about it, as we've all experienced in recent years, a democracy is really upheld by norms more than anything, right? And when you've been chipping away at those norms for decades now, yeah, those were experiments. I don't know if all of you remember that time, like when Obama wanted to appoint a Supreme Court justice, and Mitch McConnell refused that they would even interview him, right? Republicans they would not do so. That was like, whoa, really shifting the norms of what is possible. So they've been experimenting very actively, and have the Democrats? Oh, hell no, right? We want to play by the rules kind of thinking. It's pathetic. And so, very different kind of games are being, or, political strategies are being employed, at least until recently.